Good evening and welcome back to our study of heaven. Now this has been an amazing study, very invigorating for me, and I hope that it has also been for you. And so now we have seen the focus of heaven as being the throne of God, and last week we read through some portions of Ezekiel that show us kind of a visual of the throne of God, describing it for us. And we saw also that the Lamb in Revelation 4 and 5 is the center of heaven as well, that everything is described in proximity to the throne of God and to the Lamb. And then we saw some of the chronology to help us get our arms around the timing and the certain phases that all of this involves. And so it has been a fairly involved study so far, and I know that you expect that it will continue. I'm trying to keep this just as simple as I can, though, because I really want us to have instilled in us this hope of heaven. So even though some parts have been a little bit difficult and some have been maybe a little bit easier to see and grasp, I want us to have this inside of us to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that this is absolutely incredible. And so we've talked about the house of God, heaven, what we might call sometimes the intermediate heaven or the heaven of heavens. This is where God dwells, and this is where all believers go as soon as they die. All of those who are in Jesus Christ go there. And then when Christ comes at the rapture, he will bring all of those souls back, and he will raise them up first. And then those who are left, who are still alive when Christ comes, will be caught up to him and then taken to heaven before the throne of God in the house of God. And so when Christ comes again after the tribulation, he will set up his millennial kingdom. That is what we call it, the millennial kingdom, because it happens, or it is his kingdom really forever, but the first phase of it is 1,000 years, and that is described very explicitly for us in Revelation chapter 20. So go ahead and turn there. We will use Revelation chapter 20 as sort of our outline to begin speaking about the next phase, or if you remember in our chronology, all of that after the second coming is called the age that is to come. I doubt it will be called that when it actually comes, but for now, since it's the future age, the next, what we might call dispensation, we call it then the age that is to come. And it is composed first of the millennium, and then second of eternity. So 1,000 years, and then the rest of forever. So in Revelation 20, hopefully you're there by now and you're going to follow along, we find this very, very important chapter. And this isn't the only chapter that talks about the millennial kingdom, and we're going to see that, because the whole Old Testament is full of descriptions of the millennium. The New Testament is full of descriptions, but here is the most panoramic, I guess, view, the most complete view as in timeline, the most explicit as to exactly what's going to happen. And then the rest of Scripture helps us to fill this in. And so I'll give you an outline as we go. We'll read the whole chapter today, and I'll throw in some explanation, and then we'll see where we have time to go from there. I'll keep an eye on the clock. I don't want this to go too terribly long, but what I plan to do is to walk you through this chapter, and then maybe next week walk you through some, not all, we don't have time for all, but some of the Old Testament references to this millennial kingdom. So, first of all, Revelation 19 describes the end of the tribulation. It describes Christ coming, verse 11 of chapter 19, on a white horse. John says, I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. and then the beast and his armies are defeated, that is the Antichrist and the false prophet, and they are thrown, verse 20, into the lake of fire which burns with brimstone. Verse 21, the rest were killed with the sword, that is all of the armies, which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, that's Jesus, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. I know that is not a very pretty picture, but the tribulation will not be pretty. And the coming king, coming to victor over sin and sinners, will not have a very pretty job ahead of him right when he comes. But in chapter 20, we come to verse 1 here, and we find this word, and the New American Standard is translated as then. They kind of tip their hand. But the Greek just says and. And some of the translations that are trying to be a little more literal, funny because the New American Standard tries to be more literal, but every translation has some kind of interpretive gesture, I guess you could say. Translation depends upon interpretation as well. It's very difficult just to translate, exactly the words of the text because, our language is different from Greek and so forth. And so really it just says, and I saw an angel coming down from heaven. But the New American Standard tries to give us this understanding of then, and it's a correct understanding, I believe, because so many have said, well, this doesn't talk about what happens after Christ comes. This actually folds back. It goes back, and it kind of describes Revelation again as a panoramic scene, and it starts at the cross and goes all the way to the end. But there really is no exegetical, no textual reason for this. When John uses and, it's the word kai in the Greek, very typically is consecutive narrative. It's what happens next. And so it's very, very good that the New American Standard translates this then, because it helps us to understand this is what John meant. John said, then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. We've already seen, if you've read through Revelation, in chapter 9, we've seen this abyss from which many demons were released during the tribulation. But now an angel comes down from heaven holding a key and having a great big chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon. Notice all the names here, the dragon, the serpent of old, and this is the devil and Satan. And he bound him, that's Satan, for 1,000 years. With your pencil or pen, highlighter, marker, whatever, underline that word 1,000 and years. 2 words, I guess. Underline 1,000 years. You can go 3 words if you would really like to. So we have an angel coming down with a key to the abyss and a chain in his hand. And he takes Satan, he binds him with that chain for 1,000 years, and then verse 3, he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer. Mark this again until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. Now, I don't have time to kind of rehearse all of the different views. If you are familiar with the terminology, you know that there is a premillennial view and an amillennial and postmillennial view. And the amillennial, postmillennial view, I don't want to confuse anyone, but I feel like I need to throw this in here. So the amillennial and the postmillennial view says that this is going back, and it's describing from the cross all the way up to the second coming, and that at the cross Satan was figuratively bound and cast into the abyss, which is really just the earth, and that's what they believe. And I've done a lot of reading on this. I have a paper that I wrote in seminary on this, and it's really interesting because notice the text. The text doesn't say that Satan was just bound and thrown on the earth to roam around. No, he was bound in this text and taken out of the way, sealed in an abyss, bound with a chain. And the whole purpose is that he would not deceive the nations any longer until 1,000 years were completed. Now, an amillennialist will say that we are in the millennium right now. Welcome to the millennium. An amillennialist, a bad term for them, means no, so the term means no millennium, but it's saying that there's no future millennium. They believe that the millennium is present, and 1,000 years doesn't mean 1,000 years. 1,000 years means figuratively a long time. So during this church age / millennium, they would say Satan is bound and he cannot deceive the nations any longer. Quite obvious, right? We look at it and we say, well, first of all, we can look around the world and know that Satan is not bound. And he's certainly deceiving the nations today. And you look at other passages, Satan is, a lion, prowling around, and so on and so forth. And so this has to be future. This has to be after the second coming. Satan is taken completely off the earth. He's not here for 1,000 years, and it's mentioned twice. And by the way, if you underline every single time, and I'll try to remind you every time we come to 1,000-year term in this passage, I'll try to remind you to underline it. But if you go through, you will find 5 times that the words 1,000 years are mentioned. If it were figurative, why doesn't it just say a long time? John uses literal numbers all throughout Revelation. So why would we say that this 1,000 years is figurative, especially when it is repeated so many times? So this is future. Satan is taken off of the earth so that he can no longer prowl around the earth and he can no longer deceive the nations. So then verse 4, then I saw thrones. By the way, this is number 2. So first of all, Satan will be bound. Second, we find Jesus and the saints will reign. Jesus and the saints will reign. Verse 4, then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. Here is the big interpretive question. Who is them? Who is the they? It can't be who's coming next in the verse because they haven't been mentioned yet. The only antecedent that you can find are the hosts coming with the Lord Jesus Christ in Revelation 19. It's 19:14. The armies or the hosts which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. I think the best interpretation of who that is that this is the saints. These are the raptured saints who have been in heaven with the Lord during the tribulation, now coming back to Colossians 3:4, be revealed with Christ in his glory. And then Revelation 20 verse 4, for the saints I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and the judgment was given to them. And then he says, and I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image and had not received the mark on their forehead and on their hand, and they came to life. And they reigned with Christ, underline it, for 1,000 years. So, first of all, the raptured saints are given thrones. We come back and we're given thrones. And then the tribulation martyrs are raised from the dead and also given thrones, so that they too will reign with Christ during the millennium. Verse 5, we have this note, the rest of the dead did not come to life. And so we find number 3, unbelievers will remain dead. Satan will be bound during the millennium. Jesus and the saints will reign during the millennium. Unbelievers will remain dead during the millennium. Verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. And remember when we went through all that big chronology, we found that there is the first resurrection that has 3 different phases. That has several different phases. First is the rapture, second is the Old Testament saints, and third is the martyrs. And of course the first fruits of that, because I remember I have 4, the first fruits of that is Christ. So the first resurrection lasts until from Christ until the tribulation martyrs are raised. And that is before or at the beginning of the millennium. So verse 6, blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. These are all believers. Over these, the second death has no power. There's never really called a second resurrection. It's the first resurrection and the second death, but we can call it the second resurrection unto death. Okay, and over these, the second death has no power, but they will be priests. This is those who are in the first resurrection, you and me, tribulation martyrs, and Old Testament saints. They will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him, underline it again, for 1,000 years. We will reign for 1,000 years with Christ, where Satan will be bound, Jesus and the saints will reign, unbelievers will be dead. Fourth, Satan then will be released. This is after the millennium. Verse 7, when the 1,000 years, mark it again, are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. Fascinating verses back in verse 3 when it says that Satan is thrown into the abyss and is shut, is sealed, so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the end of the 1,000 years. And then after the 1,000 years are complete, he must be released for a short time. Interesting. So Christ has ruled for 1,000 years. We've ruled with him. Satan has not been out among the nations. He and his demonic horde, if you read Isaiah 24, are all shut inside the abyss. They have no power over anybody on the earth. Christ is ruling in righteousness. People are being born. The earth has multitudes and multitudes and multitudes of people on it at the end of 1,000 years, because nobody's really dying. They're living for long periods of time, just like in Genesis. I guess that would be 3, 4, 5, right before the flood. And then we find Satan released. And this will make sense when we read through some of the Old Testament passages, because we will find that even though Christ is reigning in Jerusalem during the millennium, there will be those born who will not believe in him. And then Satan is going to gather them together. Verse 7, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they come up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. Christ's reign is one of peace. He is the Prince of Peace. And so he is not going to go to war and at the end of the millennium. So when these armies are coming against him, God takes care of them. God, before they even reach Jerusalem. Verse 10, and the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So Satan is finally thrown into the lake of fire, where he will be eternally. During the millennium, Satan will be bound. Jesus and the saints will reign. Unbelievers will remain dead. At the end of the millennium, Satan will be released. And then finally, we find in verse 11 to the end, unbelievers will be judged. Look at verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. So everybody who has not at this point been resurrected will be resurrected. And they will be resurrected to be thrown, verse 14, into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So that covers the millennium. It's a panoramic view of the millennium, from right before the millennium to right after the millennium. And so we might be asking, okay, that doesn't really tell us a whole lot about specifics. What will the millennium be like? Well, I'm glad you asked. That wasn't really John's point right there. But you know what? The Old Testament gives us quite a panoramic view, or quite a view of these specifics. So let's go ahead and turn back, and I have many notes that I have for you here. Let's turn back all the way to Genesis 50. There are many verses that we could go to. We don't have time to hit them all, and I think next time we will just start in the prophets and see if we can take a time to go through Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, all the way through Malachi, and see if we can find some of these references to the millennium. Some of it's a little bit difficult because they kind of join together the millennium and eternity. Sort of when you read the prophets, they join together the first and second coming of Christ. So also there's kind of a fuzzy division in the prophets between the millennium and eternity. So we might kind of just say, well, this kind of refers to both. We're not really sure if there's a division or so on and so forth, but it'll make sense when we get there, I think. So I said Genesis 50. I'm sorry, I always do that. It's in Genesis chapter 49. This is Jacob's blessing of his children. Interesting verse when he blesses Judah. Look at verse 10. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes. That's usually understood to be a reference to the Messiah, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. And then we get this millennial kind of language here, and listen to what he says. This is the plentifulness of the millennium, that this king, Shiloh, the Messiah, ties his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are dull from wine, and his teeth white from milk. In other words, this is a land of plenty. This is a prospering land. And this is in fulfillment of everything that God told Abraham. Turn all the way back now to Genesis 15. And let's remind ourselves of this covenant that God made with Abram. And so, you know that God, we've talked about it many times, promised Abraham essentially a kingdom. He promised him land, a very specific piece of land. And we find its borders mentioned several times in the scriptures. By the way, those borders were never completely fulfilled. They were never completely occupied by Israel. But during the millennium, we find that they will be. So that is yet to be fulfilled, that this specific tract, the full tract of land, would be given to Israel as their possession. It will happen in the millennium. So Abraham was promised by God a land and a people. You know that God promised to multiply his descendants from 0 to hundreds and hundreds of thousands and millions and probably even billions, I don't know. Lots and lots and lots of descendants when he had none, and then he gave him one, and from that one he made a nation that cannot be counted. And he promised to give him not just land, not just people, but also kings. He promised him that kings would come from his loins. And so, sorry, I said Genesis 15, go over to 17 and look at verse 7. God, and one of the times he appeared to Abram and talked about this covenant, he said, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. Now listen very, very carefully to all of this. I will give to you, Abraham, and to your descendants after you, the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Now, did you catch it? It's very easy to read this quickly and we don't catch it. We know God promised that Abraham's descendants would have the land and the kingdom. But notice here, God says, Abraham, I'm giving this land to you and your descendants. Besides one tract of land, in that land, Abraham owned none of it. You could not have said when Abraham died that that land was his by any human standards. Yet God had promised it to him. And so there has to be a time in the future when Abraham will inhabit it, along with his descendants. And his king, his son who becomes king, will reign. And by the way, going all the way back now to Genesis chapter 3, this is the same king, the same son who was promised to Adam and Eve in the very beginning. When God cursed the serpent, he said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He, and we all know that that's Jesus, he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And this all happened at the cross. Christ has defeated Satan. Now all he needs to do is come back in all of his splendor and his victory and take what is his. And we are looking forward to that. And we will be in his kingdom for 1,000 years, and then on the new earth forever and ever, residing in the new Jerusalem, a fascinatingly beautiful, massive city where God himself will dwell among men. You see, as I say every week, I will show you still greater things than this.